Hi, I'm Don Bishop, creator of the Grand Hill Chronicles web novel and podcast, and today I'm going to talk about how to set up a podcast. I'm assuming you have your audio files, or maybe you are going to create those. I'm not going to talk about how to do that right now, although as you can see, I use Audacity as one of the tools. I also have another software called Mixcraft. We've got a couple of microphones, but I'm going to talk about how you set up a podcast as a podcast so that it's out there in the world and people can access it. And it took me learning how to do it myself. And I am not hosting on a podcast hosting service. And so that's kind of the niche that I'm talking towards. If you want to do things the easy way, go and sign up for a podcast hosting service. There are free ones out there, and then they have paid tiers if you end up having more hours per month that you upload, or if you have more downloads than they require that you pay. But at that point, you have a listening audience and you could probably charge for advertisement in your podcast. So it makes sense. But if you're like me, where I already had my website, I've had my website in its current iteration since 2018, and I'm paying for web hosting. I didn't want to move my site somewhere. I didn't want to uproot that to something specifically that's designed for making it easy. I wanted to work with what I already had. So if you either already have a domain and web hosting, or if you just want to have full control over your product, then this is for you. And I thought about doing this video once I got things set up successfully and had my podcast out there and it was available. And I didn't because doing the podcast itself is a lot of work. I'm writing the story of my web novel, and then I have chats with my cousin, with my sister. Maybe I'll have other guests in the future. And then, so writing the story and modifying the website from time to time. I'm modifying it right now. Like if you go on thorn.link right now and you go in and read the story while you're on a given post, a given story segment, that part of the menu will be highlighted, and that's something I set up over the weekend. So yeah, I've already got things going on. I'm busy. But I woke up this morning, I checked Facebook, and this group that I'm a member of, there was somebody there talking about, like, how do I do this? Like the exact thing that I just did, that I set up a few weeks ago. So basically I'm going to talk about what it was that I did, what it was that I explained to him that I had learned. So first of all, what's important to know is what a podcast is and how it works. Now, what is a podcast? It's kind of like a show, radio show or TV show, except it's kind of specifically audio. Some podcasts have video also. I am also uploading videos of my podcast onto YouTube. So there is a video format of my podcast. You probably already know this because you're watching this video probably on YouTube, maybe on Facebook. But a podcast is a show. It's a presentation where you can access it at your convenience. But like, how does that work? And where do you go to get your podcasts? There isn't some giant conglomerate owner of all things podcast. It's not a single place where you go. So if you're doing what I did, it's important to understand what a podcast is and how it works. So, I mean, I've stated the question, but what is the answer? What is a podcast? Essentially, a podcast is an RSS feed. It's a blog where the content is audio. So what is an RSS feed? RSS stands for RDF Site Summary, or Rich Site Summary, or Really Simple Syndication. Don't worry about what it stands for. An RSS feed is an XML document that is formatted a certain way or is tailored for specific content. What is XML? XML stands for Extended Markup Language. It is simply a way to document or communicate certain information in plain text. If you know anything about HTML, it's similar to HTML. It uses the angle braces, and you can have an object and you can nest something inside it. You can nest something inside that, and then you end that, and then you end the object. So XML is simply a way to format data in a way that can be read and it's structured. Now, an RSS feed is an XML document that is intended to be updated from time to time. And so the idea is that you let people know about your RSS feed, where to find it, and how they check from time to time to see if there are updates. So if you have your podcast in Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Stitcher or iHeartRadio, that doesn't mean if you pull up your podcast and you're listening, you're not pulling that audio file from Apple or from Google or from TuneIn. iHeartRadio has their own thing that I'll get into that in a minute. So these podcatchers, these podcast apps that you have for your phone, or these websites online, podcatchers are directories. They maintain directories, and they produce apps so that you can go and download the Google Podcasts app or the TuneIn Radio app, and you look through this list of podcasts. You're looking through their directory listings. How do those directory listings get there? People submit them. An RSS feed, people submit them. What do they submit? They submit the location of their RSS feed. They tell the directory where to look. That says, hey, there's a podcast here, check it out. So then the website will scan that. Some websites document a little more, or they download some more data. That they might download images that you have associated with that. But really, they're just creating a directory listing. They're putting in their databases where to find your podcast. So let me tell you about, in my case, I already had my website. I'm paying for web hosting for my web novel. I'm using WordPress as the platform. It's a technology that lets you create a website without going deep into code. And you can set up a site pretty quickly. However, if you're like me, and I wasn't creating a blog, I was creating a web novel, I did some tweaking of WordPress, and I don't want to migrate. And so I wanted to keep what I already had and just add to it. So my podcast is hosted on my WordPress site. So I went and told the podcatchers about my podcast. I gave them the URL, my web address of my RSS feed for my podcast. They added that to their directories, and they check back and see if there are updates. And so you have your RSS feed, right? When you create a blog post, or in this case, a podcast post, when you create a podcast episode, you add that to your site and you add that to your RSS feed. You might want to use a tool like WordPress that manages RSS feeds. I am additionally using the Blueberry plugin. I like to pronounce it in my mind as Blueberry because they don't have the E in there. I am not paying for Blueberry hosting. I'm just using their plugin for WordPress. When I create a podcast episode, I treat it somewhat like a blog post. I give it its data up there, and then I add the URL for the audio file down at the bottom and associate that with that post, and it gets added to my podcast's RSS feed. So then TuneIn Radio and Spotify and Google and Apple, they check my feed, and my feed says, hey, there's a new document here, there's a new item. Here's the podcast image for this episode. Here's the description for this episode. Oh, and here's the address for the audio file for this episode. And so when Joe, podcast listener, goes looking for a fantasy podcast in Apple Podcasts, he comes across and he finds the Grant Hill Chronicles, and it's listed in there. Okay, not fantasy. Apple and several other podcatchers don't have a fantasy category, so it's listed as sci-fi, whatever. I'm going to do a video about that too, the difference between sci-fi and fantasy, or why they're is no essential difference. So he finds my podcast and he taps on it and it opens up the information that Apple has cataloged in their database. The name of the podcast and the description of the podcast, the names of the episodes and their descriptions. And so then he taps on episode 1 or episode 2 and it starts playing. So what his app did, his app is communicating with Apple servers, and Apple has their directory where they have cataloged thousands of podcasts, including mine. And the app pulls catalog information, directory information, and displays it so he can choose what he wants to listen to. And when he taps on my podcast and episode 1, his phone is communicating with my website. And my website says, oh, you're looking for this episode. Here's the media file. Here's the audio file. Have a good day. Have a nice listen. And yeah, so I think I've communicated how it works. As far as an RSS feed is simply your it's your feed, that it's your document of what is available that will be updated from time to time. And so directories check back and see if it has been updated. If it has been, they'll update their databases, and then it'll show up in your app, and your app will know where to go to listen to that episode. That's what a podcast is and how it works. But how do you get it out there? I mentioned earlier that you tell the podcatchers about it. So you go all over the internet because there are a lot of podcatchers out there. But if you are feeling lazy and you only want to submit it to a few, I mean, Apple has the lion's share. I was really surprised to learn this because there's so many Androids out there, and I suspect that all these Android listeners aren't using Apple Podcasts. But Apple Podcasts has the market share for like podcasts being listened to. And yeah, so submit to Apple, submit to Spotify is the second biggest one, I believe, is what I read. And then other notable ones like iHeartRadio and Google Podcasts, probably TuneIn. And you probably don't need to go as extensive as I did. I submitted my RSS feed to like 30 different podcatchers. So when you go and you give them a web address, a URL, and some podcatchers do things a little bit differently. They want more information, and because like you go into Apple Podcasts and you can rate podcasts, that's just within their system. That is just within their database. So if I have Apple users that just love my podcast, but Google users don't care for it, TuneIn users, I don't think there even is a rating system in those. So they don't see that. It doesn't affect it. So, but Apple wants some extra information. I think iHeartRadio wanted some extra information. Spotify wanted some extra information. There are a few podcatchers out there that don't require any sign up or whatever. They give you the page and there's a box. You put in your RSS feed URL and then it scans it. Like it pulls that document from your website and it runs through it to make sure it's valid, and it checks and makes sure that the files that it refers to are valid, and it says, you know what, this is a valid podcast, it works, and it adds it to their directories. And databases take a little bit of time to update and propagate throughout the internet, so you're up within an hour. For others like Apple and Google, they apparently, because I mean I didn't see this on their website specifically, but they evidently use human quality control, where they have a human probably lay eyes on it, maybe even listen to a little bit, just to make sure that you are what you're represented, just to make sure that you are what you are representing yourself to be. And so for Apple and Google, it takes a few days. For Spotify and iHeartRadio, it took a couple of weeks. And that's just the process it is for them, the time that it takes. So you tell them about it, they add you to their directories. It might take a few days, it might take a couple of weeks, but voila, it's out there and people can listen to it. Now, just as far as managing your podcast, as I mentioned earlier, a podcast is an RSS feed that references audio content. I mean, that's essentially what it is. And then RSS feed is a blog so it has posts. These posts can be text. These posts can be audio. They can be video, like your YouTube channel. But an RSS feed is an XML document that is structured, so it's totally clear for computers, and they all speak the same language, and they can communicate. Where I have my RSS feed, and it shows up, my podcast shows up in the various podcatchers, but it's not very friendly to human eyes. And you can go through and you can see, okay, here's this item, and here it's child nodes, and here's the data. But it'd be super tedious to go in there and try to build the document yourself. So although technically you could, I wouldn't recommend it. You want to have some software doing that for you. I mentioned I'm using WordPress. WordPress natively handles RSS feeds. It's built for blogging. It's designed for blogging. And I'm using the Blueberry plugin for WordPress. And so then there was a little bit of learning curve on making sure I had the correct configurations so that my RSS feed would turn out the way it should, so that my podcast would appear the way I want it to in the various directories. And I actually had a problem where before I really understood what was going on, I attached my podcast episode to a post that already existed, and then I created a new post for my podcast episode, and then it was showing double in some directories. So I ended up having to delete that existing post and creating a duplicate so that it would no longer show up as double. So there was a little bit of a learning curve. But once I got that solved, I added my second episode, and it showed up in podcatchers. Like, I didn't have to go and worry about the RSS feed. I didn't have to go looking through that, which is really complicated with WordPress if you're trying to get your fingers in it, because it's not so simple. You submit a URL, which represents your RSS feed to the various podcatchers, but if you are able to browse the file system of your website, which I can do on FTP, like, that file doesn't exist. There is no such file. It's whenever somebody comes from outside saying, hey, give me this file, it creates it on the fly and hands it over. So, like, to edit that, to get into the weeds of how WordPress is creating it, you'd have to get into a lot of code. But yeah, I don't have to, because I got it up and running. Now, one last comment, and maybe there'll be more, but I read some articles out there on the internet talking about why you shouldn't self-host your podcast, because podcast hosting sites are specifically optimized for serving up audio, and because of that, they're fast enough to do it and create a good user experience. And also, hosting large files, like my second episode is 40 minutes long, so there's some megabytes in there. But hosting these large files could violate your terms of service with your web hosting service. But I think those two things are yesterday's news. Networks are faster now, storage is cheaper, and yeah, my podcast works fine. If it starts to be a problem because I'm getting a lot of traffic, wahoo, then I'll start paying for better hosting elsewhere. But for now, it's great. And I did check my web hosting service terms of service before I started, and I'm not going against anything. I checked their fair use or whatever, and yeah, I'm in the clear. So that's yesterday's news. You can go ahead and do it these days, and it's fine. Now, if you do use WordPress for your podcast hosting, some people on Facebook mentioned that you'll want to choose a theme that is designed for hosting a podcast. And I am unfamiliar with looking for themes to host a podcast, but I would highly recommend it. I'm trying to do some things with my theme, and I don't want to switch my theme because I've configured it for my website. I only want to change it little bit by little bit. Currently, I want to add infinite scrolling so that you can just keep reading my story instead of having to click to the next segment. And I'm having some trouble with that because my theme doesn't support it. And the infinite scrolling solutions that I have found aren't designed for what I'm doing with my site, where I have pages to host each chapter, but then each segment within that, each subchapter is a post. So do look for a theme that is designed to host podcasts because it will probably make your life a lot simpler and make things a lot more streamlined and easy. So if you can go off on your own and host your podcast on your own website, then what does a podcast hosting site offer? Well, first of all, they give you a platform where it is streamlined. It is easy to publish podcast episodes. Like I said, when I was cramming that into my WordPress theme that I had that wasn't designed for it, it did it. It's just not really designed for it. And it's okay. It works for me. But you can also choose a theme that is better for that purpose, for publishing a podcast. So they do provide that. And the other thing they do is that they save you the hassle of going around to all the different podcatchers to get your podcast listed in their directories. And so they save you some trouble there. And I think we're done. So hit up the comments section and ask me questions, or look me up on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. You search for Grindhill Chron and you'll find me. On Instagram, I'm Grindhill Chronicles all the way out. And stop by Patreon and drop me a little bit of change. Buy me a grilled cheese because they're delicious. And doing this stuff takes work. So subscribe here, subscribe to my podcast, and have a nice day.